time to nationalize the fossil fuel industry. Now, I know the moment you say nationalize, everybody thinks, oh my God, Venezuela, Iran. People don't think much about Norway, but you know, and all the, you know, the one time that a Democrat actually said this out loud was back in 2008. And it was during a hearing where the fossil fuel executives, the CEOs, were refusing to answer her questions. And Maxine Waters, Representative Maxine Waters, a black woman with power, something Republicans hate and fear more than anything else they can imagine. Maxine Waters basically came right out and said, if you don't start giving me straight answers, we're going to start talking about nationalizing your industry. She used the word socialize, but, you know, same thing. And, of course, Fox News went nuts. They melted down. In fact, there's a link to it over in the op-ed at HartmannReport.com. But Fox News and all those on the right, and frankly, Democrats who freaked out when Maxine Waters said this, are either unaware of or completely ignoring the long history in this country of nationalizing industries that work against the national interest during a time of crisis. And if you don't think that this is a time of crisis, this climate crisis, well, I've got a tornado to sell you. Or the fact that, hey, it's April 11th and it snowed in Portland, Oregon. There's an inch of snow on the ground outside right now. Well, it's probably down to a half inch. It's starting to melt. But, you know, it's never happened before. Last year, it was 116 degrees for 3 days in a row here. That's never happened before either. We're getting Phoenix weather alternating with North Pole weather. I mean, it's just... So, you know, if you don't think that we're in a climate crisis, you're not paying attention. And in large part, this crisis has been brought about by the fact that the fossil fuel industry, for over 40 years, has been lying to us about the impact of their product on this crisis. And funding organizations that are out there lying about climate change and denying climate change, and funding politicians. I mean, you know, look at Joe Biden had a plan, and the Democrats had a plan to spend $500 billion, $500 billion on greening the American economy that really would have taken a good bite out of climate change. It would have reduced our carbon emissions substantially in this country over the next 5 or 10 years. And it was defeated, it passed the House. It was defeated by every Republican in the United States Senate, plus Joe Manchin, who's taking money from the fossil fuel industry. In fact, he's the single largest recipient of fossil fuel industry money in the United States Senate. This is an industry that is calling out for nationalization. I mean, 40 years ago, literally 40 years ago, Jimmy Carter, this was 1979, 43 years ago, actually, Jimmy Carter declared a national crisis. And he said, you know, he was going to propose legislation to create, quote, this nation's first solar bank, which will help us achieve the crucial goal of 20% of our energy coming from solar power by the year 2000. You've heard me play the clip over and over and again. And he also, Jimmy Carter, the part that's not in the clip that I play for you so frequently, is he also wanted to create a program to sell bonds, essentially like war bonds. FDR did this during World War II. He created a nonprofit, a government agency, that sold government bonds. In other words, you could loan money to the federal government, essentially. Sold in today's dollars, you know, billions of dollars worth of government bonds to fund an effort to invent synthetic rubber. This was during World War II, because we were running out of rubber for tires for fighter jets. And it worked, and FDR did that. And so Jimmy Carter said, just as a similar synthetic rubber corporation helped us win World War II, so will we mobilize American determination and ability to win the energy war. He proposed this in '79, and, you know, it all came crashing down 42 years ago this coming January when the fossil fuel industry's candidate, Ronald Reagan, replaced Carter in the White House, killed the solar bank and bond program, and even took Carter's solar panels off the roof of the White House. So if there was ever an industry that merited nationalization, right now it's the fossil fuel industry. But what's the history of this? During the crisis of World War I, President Woodrow Wilson nationalized the country's railroads, our phone companies, and our telegraph operators. He also nationalized the radio networks and all the radio stations in this country. They were returned to private ownership after the war, but he had nationalized them during the war. During World War II, Franklin Roosevelt did the same thing. He nationalized the airplane manufacturers. He nationalized several gun manufacturers. He nationalized over 3,300 mines in the United States. He nationalized the nation's railroads. He nationalized dozens of oil companies, Western Electric Company, the Hughes Tool Company, Goodyear Tire and Rubber, and even Montgomery Ward, along with 17 foreign companies doing business in the United States. After FDR died, Harry Truman came along, finished the war. He also nationalized the meatpacking industry across the country and the Monongahela Railroad Company, the nation's steel mills, and hundreds of rail companies. Nearly all were returned to the private sector after the war was over, although it did take until 1965 to re-privatize all of them. Then came Richard Nixon. In the wake of the collapse of the Penn Central Railroad, Richard Nixon oversaw the nationalization and transfer of 20 railroads into a new government entity that was called the National Rail Passenger Corporation. Today we call it Amtrak. Richard Nixon did that. In '74, Congress created another nationalized entity to deal with freight rail. I believe this was under Jerry Ford. It was called the Consolidated Rail Corporation. We called it Conrail. And it absorbed dozens of failing rail companies. This was nationalization. And they were government held until 1987 when it was privatized. That privatizing Conrail was the third largest IPO, actually at the time it was the largest IPO in American history. In 1984, the Continental Illinois Bank and Trust Company was in a crisis, and Ronald Reagan nationalized it. He bought an 80% ownership share in the company. It wasn't privatized until 1991 by George Herbert Walker Bush and was bought by Bank of America in '94. Also in the 80s, after Reagan recklessly deregulated the savings and loan industry, we saw S&Ls crash all across the country as the guys running them made off with billions of dollars in their own private money bins. And so Reagan and Congress created an umbrella agency. It was called the Resolution Trust Corporation, and they nationalized 747 of America's savings and loans. Assets over $400 billion. They were held as nationalized companies from 1987 until 1995, when they were re-privatized. Then that was Reagan, then George W. Bush. When he was handed the White House by 5 Republican appointees on the Supreme Court, the nation's airline security was entirely in private hands. After 9/11, Bush said, okay, that's it, and he nationalized airline security across the United States. He put the entire industry out of business. He didn't even bother buying these companies up and nationalizing them. He just shut them down and replaced them with what we call the TSA today, the Transportation Security Administration. He also nationalized the nation's airlines because they were in a crisis after 9/11. He created this thing called the Air Transportation Stabilization Board that ended up holding 7.5 million shares of U.S. Airways, 18 million shares of America West Airlines, 3.5 million shares of Frontier Airlines, 1.5 million shares of Transair, 2.38 million shares of World Airways. The Bush administration nationalized, the George W. Bush administration, again, nationalized the 2 largest mortgage lenders in the United States. When the crash happened in 2008, we nationalized Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. They nationalized 77% share in AIG, 36% share in Citigroup, 73% share in GMAC, and forced out GM's president, Rick Wagner, who was just doing a terrible job. Obama came into office, and he nationalized GM and Chrysler. So, there's a long history of this. We could buy the 3 largest oil companies in the United States for less than $500 billion, about $500 billion. That's 1/4 or maybe 1/5 of the cost of the Bush tax or of the Trump tax cuts for billionaires. For 1/5 of what we paid to give tax cuts to billionaires, we could take over these 3 large oil companies and then just run them well, but stop all their funding of climate denial and start they're seriously attending to the process of figuring out how to shift themselves from being oil companies to being energy companies. I mean, this is not rocket science. I realize people are freaking out about the politics of it. Oh my God, you're going to call, they're going to call the Democrats socialists. Every president since Eisenhower, going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson, has done this during times of crisis. And this is a crisis.